Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. In today's episode, we're diving into the older story beneath Christmas, a history of Yule, and cultural amnesia. Because, every December, the same argument erupts like clockwork. Christmas is pagan. No, it isn't. Stop lying. Actually, it's Saturnalia. Well, no, it's Jesus' birthday. And I'm sure if you're like me, you've heard all of this before. Podcast listeners, in the show episode blog, I have a photo that is the typical Christian calling other Christians out. Is Christmas biblical? In the New Testament, Jesus nor his disciples celebrated his birthday. None of the early Christians celebrated his birthday. This holiday, according to the church father Origen, is pagan in nature. If you want to read the rest of it, please check out these show notes because that's where a lot of fun photos are going to be for the whole episode. And honestly, that whole argument itself is the least interesting part. And my intention behind this episode is not to cover the same old tired themes you always hear, but to weave in old traditions, stories, and myths into how we navigate winter in our modern times. Because long before doctrine, people were already gathering at midwinter, lighting fires, sharing food, hanging evergreens, leaving offerings, watching the sun closely, trying to survive the longest night of the year. And most of what we now call, quote-unquote, the Christmas spirit, the lights, the feasting, the greenery, the warmth, even the winter gift-giving, is older than Christian theology by centuries. And yet, when I converted to Christianity in 2022, none of that felt magical. It actually felt dangerous. So my first Christian Christmas, it was only a few short months into my short-lived Christian phase. And man, when December arrived, I suddenly found myself terrified that Christmas was pagan, demonic, and spiritually contaminated. I burned books, for real. I threw crystals away. I cleaned my home like I was preparing for divine inspection. I interrogated every decoration like it might be opening a portal to something dark. I am not exaggerating. I actually recently found an old document in my drive that I wrote during this time, and reading it now, it's unsettling and embarrassing. It reads like an entire bucket of fundamentalist talking points sprinkled in with some wiki conspiracies and shook it like a snow globe, you know what I mean? Some lines that I wrote: Christmas is a religious holiday, but it's not Christian. Mistletoe came from druids who used it for demonic occult powers. Santa Claus is based on Odin and meant to deceive children. Jesus does not want you to celebrate Christmas. I believed every word of it. Because fear-based Christianity works by shrinking your imagination. It makes symbols dangerous and history suspicious. The world is a spiritual minefield. And that was my first clue that this wasn't just about theology. It's obviously about fear and the inability to hold layered meaning. Because winter was sacred long before religion. For pre-industrialization people, winter was not cozy. It wasn't aesthetic. It wasn't symbolic, it was dangerous. Food stores would run low, animals died, illness spread, darkness swallowed the day. When the sun disappeared, this wasn't metaphorical, this was existential. And this is why midwinter mattered everywhere. Not because cultures shared gods, but because they shared bodies, seasons, and risks. Homes were built from thick logs, stone, and earth. And these materials, they had thermal mass that held heat long after the fire dimmed. And the hearths, they weren't just decorative. They were survival technology. Families and animals gathered together because the warmth meant life. And this honestly wasn't primitive living. It was skilled living. And it also shaped belief. Seasonal rites weren't abstract spirituality, they were instructions for how to endure. It is tempting to blame modern capitalism for the way winter has flattened into noise, urgency, and forced cheer. And sure, capitalism absolutely has accelerated the problem, but that explanation skips a much older rupture. See, pre-Christian seasonal traditions already honored limits: rest, darkness, slowness. Winter was understood as a time of contraction, not productivity. You didn't push harder in December, you pulled inward. You conserved. You waited. Those rhythms were disrupted long before department stores and advertising campaigns, because first came religious overwrite. Seasonal intelligence was reframed into theological narratives that demanded certainty and transcendence over embodiment. Then came industrialization, which severed daily life from the land, daylight, and the season entirely. Artificial light erased the night. Clocks replaced the sun. Productivity became moral. And by the time capitalism arrived in its modern form, much of the damage was already done. Capitalism didn't invent our disconnection from seasonal limits, but it did inherit it. What we're really dealing with isn't just about exploitation, it's amnesia. We forgot how winter works. We forgot how rest works. We forgot how darkness functions as part of a healthy cycle. And once that memory was gone, it became easy to sell us endless brightness in the darkest part of the year. So let's talk about what Yule actually was before Christianity rewrote it, because this is where history gets interesting. And so the earliest surviving written reference to Yule comes from the 8th century, recorded by a Christian monk, Bede, B-E-D-E, and like much of what we know about the pre-Christian traditions, it was documented after conversion had already begun. I did read that there's a suspicion that some of these monks were secretly pagans, which is why they wanted to preserve some of these traditions. Who knows? But what we do know is that the traditions themselves are much older, but the written record is fragmentary and filtered. Earlier traditions, which were primarily oral, and many were actively suppressed or destroyed, which means the written record is incomplete and always filtered through Christian authors. It does not mean the traditions were new, and it means Christianity arrived late to write them down. Later sources, around the 12th and 13th century, describe Yule as a midwinter feast involving communal drinking, oath-making, ceremonial meals, ancestral honoring, and celebrations lasting multiple days, often 12. But by the time of this writing, Christianity had already reshaped much of Nordic life, yet the seasonal patterns he records remained strikingly consistent. So unfortunately, the record is not pristine, but it is consistent enough to tell us this. Yule was a land-based seasonal response to winter, practiced long before Christianity, and remembered imperfectly afterwards. So when people talk about the 12 days of Christmas, they're unintentionally echoing Yule, not the Gospels. So what I do understand is Yule was never one thing or one specific date. Some communities marked the solstice itself. Others observed the day before it. Others celebrated after, and January, once the sun's return was more perceivable. Yule could last for days, weeks, depending on the latitude, the climate, and local conditions. This diversity wasn't really confusion, it was more like responsiveness. It was alive, it was flexible, movable. Seasonal traditions bent to the land, not doctrine. And that flexibility is one reason they survived so long. Yule wasn't only about gods, it was also about ancestors, the dead, offerings, and the household. Midwinter was understood as a liminal time, so a time between spaces, when ancestors drew near. The boundary between worlds thinned. Homes became places of hospitality, not just for the living, but also for those who came before. Offerings were left, food, drink, light like candles. And we still do this even if we pretend it's just for the children. Milk and cookies for Santa didn't come out of nowhere. They echo something far older, leaving nourishment overnight, acknowledging unseen visitors, and participating in reciprocity. The modern story makes it cute, but the older story is what makes it sacred. Across Northern and Eastern Europe, winter solstice was associated with feminine figures of light, fertility, and renewal. Many who traveled the sky, and Baltic traditions, Sol, carried the sun across the heavens. And among the Sami peoples, we have Baiwe, Beiwe, who rode through the winter sky in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, restoring fertility to the frozen land. Darkness wasn't evil, it was seen as gestational. The womb is dark. Seeds germinate underground. Transformation happens unseen. And that imagery didn't disappear, it migrated. And not just as theology, but also as habits, as when people rested, what they cooked, when they gathered, what they lit in the dark. And once seasonal memory lives in the household instead of the temple, it became very visible to authority. So I'm skipping centuries of history because I want to just add into the parts where I think tend to surprise people. When Christmas was once illegal. Because Christmas was not always embraced by Christianity in America. In fact, in the mid-1600s, Puritan leaders in New England viewed Christmas as pagan, Catholic, and morally corrupt. Everything associated with it raised suspicion. Evergreens, considered pagan. Feasting, also considered pagan. Dancing, games, and access were condemned. Taking the day off from work was seen as spiritually dangerous. In 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law banning the celebration of Christmas outright. The statute read, "Whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing labor, feasting, or any other way, every such person so offending shall pay every such offense 5 shillings." Celebrating Christmas was a finable offense, and the ban remained in effect until 1681, so that's 1659 to 1681. That's 22 years, and even after it was repealed, many New England towns treated December 25th as an ordinary workday well into the 1700s. Early American Christianity did not preserve Christmas. It straight rejected it. And yet, winter rituals have a way of surviving rejection, because now we're at the part where Christmas quietly returns, and it didn't re-enter American life through theology or a church decree, but through households. In the 17 and early 1800s, winter customs persisted in small domestic ways. Evergreen branches were still brought indoors, candles were lit in the windows, food was shared, and stories of winter figures and gift givers circulated quietly within families. These practices weren't organized or ideological. They were inherited, passed down the way people pass down recipes, songs, and seasonal habits, especially in communities tied to the land, season, and home. And they survived because they worked. They made winter bearable. They gave rhythm to darkness. They anchored people to memory and place. And over time, these household customs accumulated. By the mid-1800s, Christmas reemerged into public culture, not as a restored Christian holy day, but as a reassembled seasonal festival shaped by folklore, family practice, and winter necessity. Only later was it fully absorbed, standardized, and commercialized. And that shift from household memory to mass reproduction, well, that changed everything. And now we're going to talk about Santa Claus, commercialism, and my mom's Coca-Cola bathroom. Because Santa is one of the clearest examples of what happens when a household tradition gives way to mass culture. Podcast listeners, in the show blog, I have some really cool photos of what earlier versions of Santa look like, because it's not like what modern day mascot is. We're talking Odin, we're talking long robes, staffs, hoods, sometimes thin, sometimes kind of creepy, eerie, often dressed in green, brown, or sometimes deep red. And these figures echo older winter travelers. Like I said, Odin riding the sky, spirits roaming during Yule, and ancestors moving close. This transformation accelerated in the 1800s when American illustrators and writers began merging European folklore with newly invented holiday imagery. And by then, Santa took shape again. What's kind of cool is a photo is posted in the show notes blog, is my husband and I found a reproduction Santa figure based on an 1897 illustration. He's dressed in a long green robe, he has a staff in hand, and it's more like this Father Christmas vibe. He's got a pipe. This is very common, especially in Germanic and Scandinavian traditions, where the winter gift giver was closer to the folkloric spirit than a cozy grandfather. Seeing him in this deep forest green with that hood, this like old world posture, makes it obvious how far the modern Santa has drifted from his roots. And in the show notes blog, I have a timeline of Christmas Yule figures found in England. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but I thought it was kind of cool because it shows how it goes from Odin to Father Christmas to Santa Claus. And so by the 1900s, it's Coca-Cola who standardized him. The red suit, the white trim, the jolly, brand safe. And when I was growing up, this wasn't abstract. My mom worked for Coca-Cola when the company was based in Richmond, Virginia in the early 80s. My first word was Coke. Coca-Cola wasn't just a brand in our house, it was part of the atmosphere. My mom loved Coca-Cola decor. We had Coca-Cola signs, collectibles, and even a full bathroom. At that time, it just felt normal, cozy, Americana, traditional. I didn't realize until much later, till really when I was making this episode, how completely my sense of quote-unquote holiday spirit had been shaped by corporate nostalgia rather than ancestral memory. What I thought of as timeless wasn't really old at all. It was manufactured, standardized, and sold back to us as heritage. I mean, that doesn't make it evil, but it does matter. Because when branding replaces ritual, something gets flattened. The symbols remain, but the relationship itself, it's gone. What was once seasonal, local, and embodied becomes aesthetic, consumable, and safe. And for many of us, that's the only version of winter we were ever given. And podcast listeners, I have some classic photos of the Coca-Cola Santa that you may recognize. And I don't want this to come across as hardcore judgment, but it is reality. What was lost in that transformation wasn't belief, but relationship to land, to season, and to memory. And for people who held on to that relationship longest were already labeled for it. And what do I mean by that? Well, the word heathen never originally meant immoral, evil, or godless. It meant rural, living out, away from the city. In its earliest known form, the word means woman of the heath, the open, uncultivated land beyond cities and roads. From there, it spread through Germanic languages, Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, and clergy used heathen to describe those who kept ancestral customs while cities converted to Christianity. There's an 8th century monk who wrote about the rural people, calling them the wild heathen. Offerings to trees, sprigs, and stones were condemned as sacrilege. Over time, heathen merged with the Latin word paganus, Paganus, which means rural dweller. And so what began as a description of people who would not leave the wild became a moral accusation. The fear was never really about gods. Paganism, heathen, was never about a belief. It was about those who lived on the land that refused to be controlled. So what actually happened and why the old ways are calling us back? So the same patterns repeat across centuries: suppression, survival, absorption, and forgetting. But we need to be honest about what that suppression really looked like. This was not a gentle handoff from Yule to Christmas, is what I'm referencing. It wasn't a mutual exchange. It wasn't a respectful evolution. Christianity did not simply reinterpret older traditions. It destroyed them wherever it could. And this is not rhetoric. It's history. Historian Catherine Nixie documents this process in The Darkening Age. Early Christianity treated pagan traditions not as ancestors, but as enemies. Temples were smashed, Statues were defaced, sacred groves were cut down, libraries were burned, seasonal rites that had structured life for centuries were criminalized. This destruction was not hidden or accidental, but it was celebrated. Christian writers praised the demolition of temples. They mocked the old gods as demons. Beauty, pleasure, ritual, and joy were reframed as moral danger. Festivals became obscene. Feasting became gluttony. The body itself became suspect. What could not be eradicated outright was stripped, renamed, and absorbed while its origins were denied. The solstice, well, that became Christ's birth, but obviously we all know Christ wasn't born on December 25th. The returning sun became a metaphor. Evergreens became safe symbols. Ancestral offerings were reduced to child's fantasy. But that's not borrowing, it was conquest, followed by selective inheritance. When that conquest met resistance in rural places and households and in women's hands, it adapted, it waited, it layered itself over what remained. And this is why the seams still show. And that is why Christmas has always felt haunted, layered, conflicted, unstable. What survived did so despite institutional Christianity, not because of it. It survived in kitchens and in hearths, in fields and in forests, in winter nights and quiet ritual, in land-based people who refused to forget how seasons worked. Centuries later, capitalism finished what religion began. What remained was flattened into nostalgia, branding, and spectacle, not because the old ways were weak, but because they were powerful. The call feels loud again. The pull people feel now towards solstice, ancestors, darkness, rest, and land is not based in aesthetics. We're not talking just Pinterest here. It is memory. It is the body remembering rhythms it was trained to forget. It is the psyche rejecting constant light, constant productivity, constant cheer. It's the old intelligence resurfacing after centuries of suppression. The old gods were never gone. They were buried. Winter has a way of thawing buried things, though. If something in you responds to the fire, the darkness, the offering, or the pause, that doesn't mean you're rejecting modern life or indulging in fantasy. I think it means you're responding to a pattern much older than doctrine, older than empire, older than the fear that tried to erase it. What was destroyed is now stirring. What was taken is now being remembered. And remembering doesn't end here. In a few days, I'll be sitting down with Universal Pagan Temple for a conversation on pagan culture, ritual, history, and lived practice. If this piece brought up questions for you about Yule, Mother's Night, ancestral work, or what reclaiming these traditions really looks like, I'd love to carry them into that conversation. So feel free to leave your questions in the comments or send them my way. And this is how the old ways return. Quietly, carefully, through memory, practice, and conversation. And that's all I have for you today, folks. So please help my little podcast grow. If you're on Substack, give it a like. Make sure you're subscribed. Please share this post with someone. If you're on YouTube, give this video a like. Leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. If you're on Spotify or Apple, leave me a 5-star review. And, just show me some love. I'd love to hear from you. And until then, have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And as always, embrace skepticism, stay curious, and keep tuning in.